They say a king cannot be broken, that the crown fuses to the skull, that power becomes bone, that a man who has conquered nations cannot be undone by a single woman walking away. They're wrong. Every empire ever built has one foundational crack. Not armies, not traitors, not the slow rot of politics. It's the moment you look at the person who held your world together and realize you treated devotion like furniture. She's gone. And the palace you built? It's just stone now. Stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're watching this story unfold. The morning Nisara Solvine rode through the gates of the Sunless Palace. The sky above Vareth was the color of a bruise that hadn't finished forming. Not quite purple, not quite gray. The kind of sky that makes soldiers check their swords without knowing why. Arion Thorne stood on the western parapet alone, which was already strange. A king alone was either grieving or plotting. He was doing neither. He was watching. She came on a black horse, no escort, no banners. Just herself and the deliberate slowness of someone who knows every eye in the courtyard is already on her. Midnight silk, dark hair loose at her shoulders. She didn't look up at the parapet. She didn't need to. She knew he was there. Arion's jaw tightened. His knuckle found the stone railing and pressed until the skin blanched. Behind him, his head chamberlain. Dreveth cleared his throat twice before speaking. My king, Lady Solvine has arrived. She carries a letter of open passage bearing your seal. I know. Shall I inform the queen? Arion was quiet for 3 full seconds. In the language of kings, 3 seconds is a speech. No. Dreveth bowed and retreated, his footsteps swallowed by the wind. What Arion did not tell Dreveth, what he told no one, was that he had written that letter of passage himself, 3 weeks prior, at 2 in the morning, while Seris slept 2 corridors away, and Kaler's nursemaid hummed something low and rhythmic in the east wing. He had written it in a state he would later refuse to name. Not longing. That word was too clean for what it was. More like a hunger he had spent years convincing himself was something else. He had sent the letter, and now she was here. And whatever he'd imagined this moment would feel like, it didn't feel like that. It felt like the first step off a very high ledge. Queen Seris Vale learned of Nisara's arrival, the way she learned most things that mattered in the Sunless Palace, through the quality of a silence rather than any spoken word. She was in the lower garden with Kalor, helping him chase a green-backed beetle across a flagstone path. When she saw the way the 2 guards at the garden entrance straightened in unison and exchanged a glance they thought too quick to be noticed. She had been fluent in those glances for 6 years. She let Kalor capture his beetle. She watched him cup it gently in both hands, face screwed into the fierce concentration of a 4-year-old holding something precious and alive. Don't squeeze, she told him. I won't, he said. I'm not squeezing. I know, you never do. She brushed a strand of dark hair from his forehead, her fingers steady. Let it walk on your palm. Let it choose. She looked up at the palace towers. Somewhere inside those walls, history was rewriting itself. She could feel it the way animals feel weather 3 days before it arrives. Not panic, just a low vibration in the chest, a tightening of attention. She helped Kalor release the beetle onto a patch of clover. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and walked back inside with the deliberate calm of a woman who has long understood that composure is its own form of armor. The formal greeting happened in the Amber Hall, which was the second largest receiving room in the palace, and therefore the one Arion chose when a meeting demanded significance but not the full weight of the throne room. 16 advisors stood in an arc behind him. 6 ladies in waiting attended Seris. The hall smelled of beeswax and the particular cold that old stone holds even in summer. Nisara entered alone. She moved the way someone moves when they've spent years training themselves to look effortless. There was craft in her ease, theater. But it was good theater, Seris would give her that. The kind that makes you angry precisely because part of you admires it. My king, Nisara said. Her voice was lower than Seris expected. Rougher, like gravel wrapped in expensive cloth. Arion inclined his head. Lady Solvine, Vareth welcomes you. It was perfectly correct. Politically seamless. And somehow the most intimate sentence Seris had ever heard him speak to another person because of what lived inside the formal words. The history that made the formality necessary. My queen. Nisera turned to Seris with the kind of smile that knows exactly what it's doing. Not warm, not cold, calibrated. Your reputation for grace precedes you. Seris met the smile with one equally precise. As does yours, Lady Solvine. We hope your journey from the eastern provinces was comfortable. Every road becomes comfortable, Nisara said, when you know what's waiting at the end. She looked at Arion as she said it. Arion did not look away. Seris watched the space between them. Not with jealousy yet, because jealousy requires surprise, and she was past surprise. She watched with the quiet, devastating attention of a woman cataloging evidence she already knew she'd find. The way his posture shifted almost imperceptibly when she entered. The way his breathing changed rhythm. The way 6 years of careful guardedness dissolved in small betrayals too subtle for his advisors to catch. But not for her. She had studied this man the way desert travelers study the horizon, because survival depends on reading it correctly. Later that night, Arion came to her chamber, not as a husband seeking warmth, as a king managing logistics. She was at her writing desk when he knocked. 2 sharp raps, his signature. She set down her quill and said, "Come in." He stood in the doorway without crossing the threshold. That told her everything before he spoke. Nisara will be housed in the East Wing, he said. She's agreed to serve as a diplomatic envoy for the Solvine territories. Her presence is political. Is it? Yes. She kept her voice level, not cold. Levelness and coldness are different instruments, and she knew which one had more range. Arion. She looked at him fully. You don't have to explain Lady Solvine's presence to me as though I'm an advisor requiring briefing. Something crossed his face. Not guilt. He wasn't there yet. Something older. The expression of a man who is relieved someone hasn't asked the question he couldn't honestly answer. I just wanted you to understand the context, he said. I understand it perfectly. She turned back to her desk. Good night, my king. He hesitated in the doorway for a moment she didn't acknowledge. Then he left. She sat very still for a while after that, listening to his footsteps recede down the marble corridor. Then she picked up her quill and wrote 3 lines in her private journal, a leather book she kept hidden in the false back of her desk drawer. She didn't write what she felt. She was long past indulging that particular exercise. She wrote what she observed, dates, details. The catalog of a woman building a record of reality before reality could be revised. The next 2 weeks moved the way catastrophe always moves in courts, slowly and then all at once. Nisara was brilliant, and the court felt it before they consciously registered it. She had that quality of a person who makes every room feel like it was slightly drab before they arrived. Not because she performed for the room, because she genuinely wasn't trying to impress anyone, and somehow that indifference was more magnetic than effort. She knew history. Not the polished kind taught in academies, but the actual kind, but the dirty compromises, the buried alliances, the way the Vareth Empire had grown not through heroic battles alone, but through strategic marriages, mercantile pressure, and the occasional strategically convenient death. She and Arion began meeting in the council room in the mornings, ostensibly to discuss Eastern territorial matters. The meetings ran long. Seris knew because she tracked the timing of her husband's movements the way a navigator tracks stars, not obsessively, not from anxiety, but because information was survival, and she had never been able to afford the luxury of willful ignorance. One morning, she crossed the inner courtyard. At the same moment, Arion and Nisara were emerging from the council room, walking side by side, in the middle of a conversation that died the instant they saw her. That death of conversation was the cruelest data point she'd gathered yet. Not the conversation itself, the dying of it. Arion's expression went to the neutral mask she knew better than any other face he wore. Seris, my king. She kept walking, perfectly measured pace. Lady Solvine, a nod that said nothing and therefore said everything. She made it around the corner and down 6 steps before she stopped moving. She stood in a narrow stone corridor that smelled of torch smoke and the rain that had come through a crack in the ceiling, and she put one hand flat against the wall and pressed until she could feel the stone's grain cutting into her palm. Not because she was breaking, because she needed to remember what solid felt like. 3 deep breaths. Then she let go of the wall, looked at her palm where the stone had left a faint red pattern, and kept walking. That afternoon, she took Kaylor to the palace's northern reading room, a place large enough to feel like refuge and small enough to feel like shelter. She read to him for 2 hours. an old frontier tale about a cartographer who mapped a kingdom no one else could see. Kaelor fell asleep against her side with his mouth slightly open and his hands curled loosely like a flower that hadn't decided yet whether it was opening or closing. She sat in the chair with his weight against her and did not move. In her mind, she was not in the reading room. She was in a place without walls, calculating, not revenge. She was not built for revenge. It required a fixation she couldn't afford. She was calculating something harder, the architecture of what came next. Who she was in a world that was actively revising her importance, what she owed herself after years of investing dignity in a man who was, she was beginning to confirm, not capable of recognizing what he had until its absence became undeniable. She was not angry yet. Anger would come. She knew that. But first came the clarity. And clarity, she had learned, is the most dangerous condition a person in power can encounter, because it strips away all the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about why we've accepted what we've accepted. Kaelor murmured something in his sleep. She put her hand gently on his hair. She stayed. The court erupted on a Tuesday. It started, as most palace unravelings do, with something small. A seating arrangement at a formal banquet, Nisara placed to Arion's left, closer than protocol dictated for a diplomatic guest, while Seris sat at the far end of the high table in the position traditionally reserved for a dowager or visiting dignitary. Not the queen's seat. Not quite. Someone noticed. Someone always notices. By dessert course, the whisper had multiplied and divided like cells, and by the time the candles guttered and the hall began to empty, there were fully formed theories circulating about what the placement meant, what it signified, what was coming. Seris ate every course. She spoke with Lord Fen on her left about the northern grain harvest, and with Lady Aldris on her right about the late spring flooding in Caldis province. She laughed twice, both times genuinely, because it cost her nothing to be present with people who weren't the problem. She drank 2 cups of wine, not 3. She was performing nothing. That was the thing they never understood about her. The court, the advisors, even Arion himself. They always assumed her composure was theater, that beneath the stillness there must be either numbness or suppressed chaos. They were wrong. The stillness was real. It had been built across years of living in a palace where emotional outburst was a weapon that could be used against you. She had refined herself the way iron is refined, not by adding softness, but by burning out everything that couldn't survive the fire. After the banquet, Lord Casson, Arion's most senior military advisor, fell into step beside her in the long corridor outside the hall. He was a thick man in his 60s with the kind of face that had been ugly so long it had grown into something close to distinguished. "My queen," he said, low and level. "A word." She kept walking. "Walk with me, Lord Casson. The court is unsettled." He matched her pace. "There are questions circulating about the nature of Lady Solvine's position in the palace. Questions that, if left to answer themselves, will answer badly. Questions usually do, when left unattended. Is the king aware that his—" He stopped himself. Reformulated. "Is the king aware of the perception his behaviors are generating?" Seris turned a corner. The corridor narrowed and the candlelight was more sparse here, throwing long shadows across the stone floor. "What would you have me do, Lord Casson?" He was quiet for a moment, which she respected. He was choosing his words like a man picking his way across uncertain ground. "You have a son, my queen. Kaelor's position at court depends on the stability of your standing. If that standing becomes what?" He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. The old soldier met her eyes with the directness of a man who had spent 40 years in situations where honesty was more practical than comfort. "If it becomes something that can be publicly dismissed," he said, "then so does his." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you for saying what you said plainly, Lord Casson. It takes a specific kind of courage to speak plainly inside palace walls." She left him in the corridor and walked to Kaelor's chamber. She stood in the doorway watching her son sleep. His nursemaid nodded from the corner chair, half drowsing herself, and Seris waved her to proper rest. She stood in the doorway alone. Lord Casson was not wrong. This was what she had been calculating in the reading room, in the garden, in the long silent stretches between one formal obligation and the next. Kaelor's name, Kaelor's future, Kaelor's claim to anything in this empire ran through her standing as queen. And if Arion chose, publicly and formally, to reorganize the hierarchy of his personal loyalties, There were legal and political mechanisms that could follow from that choice that would leave her son's position precarious in ways that no amount of her own careful maneuvering could fully prevent. She was not afraid for herself. She was afraid for him. And that fear was a different country entirely. The confrontation she hadn't sought came anyway. It happened in Ariane's private study, 2 days after the banquet. She had requested the meeting, a formal request, because they had arrived at a point in their marriage where formal requests were the honest language. I was behind his writing table when she entered. He stood, which was habit, which was courtesy, which meant nothing, and also meant everything, because courtesy maintained in the absence of affection is one of the cruelest gestures a person can make. She sat without being invited. He sat back down. "You requested a private audience," he said. "I did." She folded her hands in her lap. "I want to talk about what's happening, not as queen to king, as the two people this marriage actually belongs to." Something moved across his face, discomfort or recognition. She couldn't be certain which. "Seris, I'm not going to perform outrage for you," she said. "I think you've been waiting for me to, and I want to remove that expectation cleanly. I don't do performance." He was quiet. "What I want," she continued, "is honesty. Whatever you decide, whoever you choose to build your private world around, that decision affects Kalar. It affects his name and his standing and his safety in this court. That's what I'm here to discuss." Ariane leaned forward and put his forearms on the table. He had big hands. She had always noticed that. The hands of a man who had done physical work before he had done political work. "Nothing has been decided," he said. "Something has already been decided," she said. "The seating arrangement at the banquet decided something. The morning council meetings that run 2 hours past schedule have decided something. The way you looked at her when she walked into the Amber Hall decided something." She kept her voice even. "I'm not asking you to deny any of it. I'm asking you to be honest with me about where this is going so that I can make decisions accordingly." He stood up, walked to the window, stood with his back to her, looking out over the inner courtyard. When kings stand with their backs to the room, they are either thinking or evading. With Ariane, it was often both simultaneously. "What do you want me to say?" he said finally. "I want you to say the true thing, whatever it is." He turned around, and the look on his face was one she had never seen on him before. Not guilt, not defiance, but something rawer than either. The expression of a man who has spent years building elaborate justifications for his choices and is suddenly aware of how flimsy the architecture is. "Nisara and I have a history," he said. "A history I didn't close properly before the political arrangements of our marriage. I've been—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I've been confused." "Confused," she repeated, "about what I want." The words came out with the effort of a man pulling something heavy uphill. "About what this life is supposed to feel like." "And what does it feel like?" Another long pause. "Like I've been living in a room someone else decorated." She sat with that. Let it exist in the space between them for a moment. Then she said, "That might be the most honest thing you've ever said to me." He looked at her with something close to surprise. "It's also," she said, standing slowly, "the thing you should have said 6 years ago, or 4 years ago, or last year. On any of the 100 evenings when I sat across from you at dinner and tried, quietly, without spectacle, to understand what you needed, and you gave me silence instead." She picked up her gloves from the chair beside her. "I gave you years of patience, Ariane. I gave you a son. I gave you the dignity of never once making your court watch me unravel. And what I needed was for you to look at me, actually look, not through me to whatever you were already thinking about, and tell me that much truth, even a fraction of it." He said nothing. "I don't hate you for what you feel," she said. "I hate that you never trusted me enough to feel it honestly while there was still time for it to mean something different." She walked to the door. "Seris?" His voice was different, rougher, stripped of the formal register. She stopped but didn't turn. "I'm sorry," he said. She stood for a moment with her hand near the door. "I know you are," she said. "That's the saddest part of all of this." She left. The days after that meeting were strange in the way that the period between a decision made and a decision enacted is always strange. The world looking superficially normal while something structural has already shifted beneath it. Seris moved through the palace with the same precise grace she always carried, attended dinners, received petitioners in the Queen's court, oversaw Kaler's daily lessons. But behind her eyes something had settled. The calculation was complete. The clarity she had been moving toward had arrived, cold and clean as northern water. So began, quietly and without announcement, to prepare. Not revenge. Not battle. Preparation in the way a person prepares who understands that certain chapters end not with a dramatic scene, but with a door quietly pulled shut. She wrote 3 letters. One to her sister in the province of Aldenmere, one to the retired Lord Dian who had served her family before her marriage and still owed her a debt of honor, and one to the administrator of the Eldra Reach, a modest northern province she had visited once before Kaler was born and had never forgotten. Open land, northern wind, people who cared less about lineage than about competence. She did not send the letters immediately. She was not there yet. She needed to know for certain, because she had made herself a promise years ago. She would not leave on suspicion. She would leave on fact. And the fact had not yet been made public. It was made public on a cold Thursday, before the assembled High Court, beneath the stone faces of dead monarchs. Aerion had called the session. Emergency session, the summons said. Matters of imperial stability and clarity of succession. Those words were political language for something the court had been waiting for, each in their own way, since the night of the seating arrangement. Seris stood below the dais with Kaler's hand in hers. I was 4 years old and did not understand the significance of the room. He was preoccupied by a loose thread on his ceremonial sleeve, which he was working at methodically with 2 fingers. "Stop that," she murmured, without looking at him. He stopped and leaned against her leg instead. Aerion was on the dais. Nisara stood to his left at a distance that was 1 step too close to be anything other than a statement. The High Chancellor read the formal preamble, the language that preceded all major imperial declarations. It was long and archaic, and no one listened to it. Everyone was watching Aerion's face. She watched it too. I was doing what he always did when he'd made a decision he couldn't unmake. He was looking just slightly above the crowd, the way men do when they need to feel alone in a room full of people. His jaw was set. His shoulders were the shoulders of a man who has translated a private choice into a public act and is now living inside the irreversibility of it. She had loved him once, she thought. Not the burning love of ballads. That was never what they were. But something real. The kind of love that grows between 2 people who are both trying, even imperfectly, to build something livable from an arrangement neither of them chose. She had loved the moments when the formal mask slipped, when he laughed too loud at a council member's honest mistake, when he held Kaler as a newborn with such absolute terror she could see his hands shaking. She had loved the human inside the king. The High Chancellor's voice rose in register, which meant the preamble was done and the declaration had begun. She listened to the words with the specific stillness of a person hearing a verdict they have already accepted. He chose Nisara openly, not formally. The legal mechanisms of formal arrangements would take longer and would be carefully dressed in political language about security and alliances. But the declaration of intent was there, written between every line, unmistakable to every noble, advisor, servant, and petitioner in the hall. Silence arrived. Not the gradual quiet of attention settling, the immediate silence of an axe falling. Kaler looked up at his mother. "Mama, why is it quiet?" "Because something important just happened," she said softly. "Is it good?" She looked down at him. His face was open and honest and completely unguarded in the way that only children and certain animals can be open. Not because they're naive, but because they haven't yet learned that openness can be used against you. "It's real," she said. "And real is more important than good or bad." He seemed to accept this, the way small children accept things they don't fully understand but trust the source of. She looked back at the dais. Aerion was finally looking at her, and what she saw in his face in that moment was the thing she had been waiting to understand for years. The truth underneath the formality, the king underneath the crown, the man who had written that letter of passage at 2 a.m. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look certain. He looked like a man who has just stepped off a high ledge and realized, in the air between up and down, that he wasn't sure he had wanted to jump. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she did the thing that would be talked about in the Sunless Palace for years after. Not by the historians, but by the servants, the guards, the low-ranking courtiers who were close enough to see the details. She did not weep, did not plead, did not turn to the court for sympathy or theater. She simply looked at him one last time with the full weight of 6 years, and one honest conversation, and then she looked away. Not in defeat, in conclusion. She took Kaler's hand and turned toward the great doors of the High Court chamber. The crowd parted, not because she demanded it, but because people move instinctively out of the way of someone who is no longer asking for passage. Behind her, she heard nothing. No command to stop. No voice cutting across the chamber. Even the silence, she noticed, had given her something. She walked out of the Sunless Palace with her son and the particular freedom of a woman who has spent 6 years learning the shape of a cage and has finally been given irrefutable evidence that it was never really locked. She walked toward the carriages. She did not look back at the palace walls or the towers or the banners of conquered houses trembling in the cold morning wind. She had already looked at all of it enough times to carry it wherever she needed without needing to see it again. Kaler walked beside her, hand in hers, asking about lunch. She answered him. Behind them, inside the Sunless Palace, Arion stood on the imperial dais in front of the assembled high court, and for the first time in his reign, the King Alpha of Vareth had no idea what to do next. What no one in that room understood, not Nisara, not the advisors, not the Lord who was already calculating his political position in the new landscape, was that Seris had not left in anger or grief or even in the clean dignity it appeared. She had left because of something she had written in her journal the night after the confrontation in Arion's study. A single sentence. The sentence she had been working toward for years without knowing its shape until it arrived. She had written, "The woman who survives a king's blindness does not do it by waiting to be seen. She does it by learning to see herself first." She had left because she had finally seen herself clearly, and what she saw was someone who deserved more than a man's regret. But the carriage was barely through the outer gate. Kaler already asleep against her shoulder, the city of Vareth scrolling past the window like a story she was reading for the last time. When a rider came, hard and fast, hooves striking cobblestone in a cadence too urgent for ceremony. He pulled level with the carriage and the driver slowed without being told. The rider's face was pale, not with cold, with something worse. He spoke through the carriage window in a voice that was barely a voice at all, and the message he carried, 4 words, precise and devastating, from a source she had not expected and could not ignore, meant that everything she had just chosen was about to become infinitely more complicated. 4 words that changed the weight of her departure from escape to something with teeth. 4 words that meant she was no longer simply leaving, she was being hunted. The writer's name was Pell. He was 19 years old, a junior courier in the palace's northern dispatch, and his hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Seris had known him by face for 2 years, a quiet boy, methodical, not given to theater. The shaking was real. She looked at him through the carriage window for a moment before she spoke. "Say it again," she said. Slower. Pell swallowed. "Lord Dane is dead, my queen." She had heard it right the first time. She sat back in the carriage seat. Kaler shifted against her shoulder without waking. Outside the window, the outer city of Vareth moved past in its ordinary morning business. Market stalls opening, a blacksmith's hammer starting its rhythm, 2 women arguing over a cart of cloth. The world continuing, indifferent, the way it always does when something private detonates. Lord Dane, 63 years old. A man who had survived 4 decades of Vareth politics, 3 regime transitions, and 2 assassination attempts that everyone knew about, and at least 1 more that no one discussed. A man of iron constitution and careful alliances who had, by every reasonable measure, nothing wrong with him when she had last received his correspondence 6 days prior. "How?" she said. Pell's jaw worked. "The official word from the Eastern Chancery is his heart." She noted the word official. Noted the way he separated it from the word, as though they were not naturally the same thing. "And the unofficial word," she said. He glanced once at the driver, then back at her. "He was found in his study, my queen. The room was locked from the inside. But his steward, an old woman who has worked his household for 30 years, she told the first courier who arrived that the Lord had received a visitor the night before. A visitor who came after dark and was shown in without being announced." "Did she describe the visitor?" "She said he wore palace colors." The carriage moved through the gate and into the wider road. The morning light was thin and white, the kind that makes everything look slightly more fragile than it actually is. Seris did not look at Pell anymore. She looked at her son. His face in sleep had the total relaxation of a person who still believed the world was fundamentally safe. She had written to Dain 6 days ago. The letter she'd sent had said nothing explicit. She was too careful for explicit. But it had asked him to prepare a specific kind of assistance. The kind that would allow a queen and a child to move across Vareth's northern territories without leaving a trail visible to the palace administration. Someone had read that letter before it arrived. Or someone had read Dain's response. Or someone had been watching her correspondence for longer than she'd realized. She had underestimated the speed of it. That was the error. She had believed she had time to be deliberate, and deliberation had become a liability. Pell, she said, my queen. You came to me instead of reporting to the palace dispatch office first. He met her eyes. Yes, my queen. That was a risk. Yes, my queen. She looked at him for a long moment. He was 19 and frightened and had done an honest thing at significant personal cost. She had met very few entirely honest people in 6 years of palace life. She found them more valuable than most things with a monetary price. Ride east, she said. Not back to the palace. To your family, if you have family east of the city. If not, ride to the Caldus province. Find the silversmith district. Ask for a woman named Orla. Tell her Queen Vale sent you. She'll take you in. He stared at her. My queen, you came to tell me something that someone in the palace did not want me to know. That makes you a liability to whoever sent that visitor to Lord Dane's study. Go east, today. He held her gaze for another second. Then he nodded, once, with the decisiveness of someone who has just understood a situation in full and has chosen to survive it. He turned his horse and rode. Seris watched him go. Then she spoke to the carriage driver, a man named Holt, who had driven the Queen's carriages for 4 years, and who she had long suspected was smarter than his position required. She spoke in a low and level voice, and she told him to change their route, not toward the northern road to Eldra Reach. Not yet. First toward the lower merchant district, because there was a woman there she needed to see, and she needed to see her before whoever had sent that visitor to Dain's study realized the Queen's carriage had not yet left Vareth's city limits. Meanwhile, in the Sunless Palace, Arion was discovering what power feels like when its customary anchor has been removed. This is a truth that kings learn too late. Authority is not self-sustaining. It requires constant inputs. Loyalty generated through fear, yes, but also the subtler, more durable inputs of competence, routine, and the invisible organizational work of the people around them who believe in the institution, even when they are ambivalent about the man. Seris had contributed to those inputs for 6 years in ways Arion had categorized as background rather than essential. I was now encountering what happens when background becomes foreground through its absence. By mid-morning, 3 separate pieces of administration had fractured. The household steward, a man who had deferred to Seris on domestic operations for 5 years, came to Arion's study with a question about the quarterly supply orders for the East Wing kitchens, because the Queen had always handled that negotiation with the merchants, and without her directive he could not proceed. Arion told him to figure it out. The steward bowed and retreated, and the problem compounded invisibly. By noon, 2 ladies-in-waiting had presented themselves at Nisara's door, asking for guidance on the weekly court schedule, a schedule Seris had managed with the precision of a military logistics officer. Nisara told them to refer to precedent. They informed her there was no written precedent because the Queen had operated from memory, intuition, and 6 years of relationship with the relevant parties. Nisara sat with that information for a moment in a way she did not allow to be visible. Arion ate lunch alone in his study. He had not done that in 4 years. Not because he and Seris had always eaten together, but because Kaelor had always been present at midday, brought by his nursemaid to sit beside his father and ask questions about horses or soldiers or the mechanics of how things worked. The study was very quiet. He found himself looking at the door twice in the space of an hour, which was a habit he identified and was irritated by. He told himself the irritation was manageable. He was wrong, but he wouldn't understand that for another 3 days. There is a specific delusion that men who have exercised absolute authority for long enough develop, and it is this. They believe that the discomfort of a consequence can be willed into irrelevance, that choosing something means having chosen correctly, that the very act of a decisive king making a public commitment creates a reality in which that commitment generates the outcomes the king envisioned. Arion was a brilliant military strategist and a competent political administrator, and he had held this delusion without examining it for the entirety of his reign. because he had never been wrong in a way he could not reframe as a strategic recalibration. This was different. He could feel that it was different. He just didn't have the language for why yet. Nisara came to his study at 2 in the afternoon. She entered without knocking, which was her habit and which he had always found attractive as an expression of certainty rather than rudeness. Today, it landed slightly differently. She looked at his face and read it with the accuracy of a woman who had spent years learning to read him. "You're in your head," she said. "I'm always in my head." "You're in the part of your head where you second-guess yourself. That's a different address." She sat across from his writing table. She had the physical ease of someone who has decided to belong somewhere. "Tell me." "Nothing to tell." "Arion." Her voice dropped. The particular register she used when the performance was off, and the actual person was speaking. "Talk to me." He looked at her, and the thing he had never fully admitted to himself, which was becoming harder to avoid now that the comfortable architecture of the past 6 years had been publicly demolished, was that Nisara was extraordinary. She was brilliant and fierce, and understood him in the bone-deep way that only a person who has known you before your most armored years can understand you. He had not invented the connection. It was real. And also it had cost him something irreplaceable. I was sitting with both of those facts simultaneously, which is one of the harder things a human being can do, and which he had no practice doing. "I need you to tell me something honestly," he said. "That's usually not a good opening," she said. "Did you know Seris would leave?" She was quiet for a moment. The window behind him threw afternoon light across her face, and he watched her choose her words. "I knew she wasn't the type to stay in a position that had become publicly untenable," she said. "I knew she had too much self-possession for that." "You admire her." "I respect her. Those aren't the same thing, but they're related." She leaned forward. "What I didn't know was how the room would feel after." "Which room?" "This one." A pause. "The palace." "Your face." He stood up, walked to the window and stood with his back to her, which he knew she would read correctly. He was not excluding her. He was trying to think in a direction he couldn't reach while looking at a person. "I made the decision I made," he said. "I don't regret the decision, but I underestimated the cost of it." He pressed his knuckle against the stone window frame. "Regret and underestimation are different problems. I can live with regret. Underestimation is a strategic failure." She was quiet behind him. He could feel her thinking. "You're not worried about her," Nisara said slowly. "You're worried about what she's going to do." He turned around. She looked at him with the steady eyes of a woman who has known this man long enough to know when he is afraid, and has learned that the correct response to his fear is not comfort, but clarity. "She's not fragile, Arion. She never was. You knew that when you married her." "I knew it." "Then what did you think would happen when you publicly—" "I thought she would stay," he said. The words were out before the cleaner version could stop them. Nisara looked at him. He let the words sit, because they were the honest ones, and he had just told her he needed honesty, and that meant he owed it first. "I thought she would stay," he said again, quieter. "In some form. I thought, she's been here 6 years, she built her life here, Kaelor is here." He shook his head. "I thought the weight of what was here would be greater than her dignity," Nisara said. The word landed like a cold, flat stone. He didn't answer. She looked at him for a long moment, and something crossed her face that was not quite regret and not quite anger. Something more complicated, the expression of a woman who has won something and is in the process of determining what winning actually costs. "You need to find out where she is," she said. "I know where she is. She's heading north. She has family connections, and not to bring her back." Nisara's voice sharpened. "To make sure Kaelor is safe. Whatever you feel about the marriage, about me, about any of it, that child is your heir. And an heir moving across open territory with a queen who has every reason to be angry, and no palace protection is a political liability you can't afford." He looked at her. "Send riders," she said, not to intercept, to observe and protect. Discreetly. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he went to his desk and wrote the dispatch order. He did not tell her about Lord Dane. He would not tell her about that for another 48 hours, by which point it would no longer matter who knew. The woman Seris needed to see in the lower merchant district was named Cassit Vorel, and she operated a textile import business from a long, narrow building on the second canal, a business that was legitimate in the way that certain enterprises are legitimate, accurately documented, tax compliant, and also responsible for moving things across Vareth's territory that had no documentation because documentation was not the point. Cassett was 50 years old and had the face of a person who had decided in their mid-30s to stop pretending that other people's opinions were relevant data. She had known Seris for 4 years, since Seris had quietly redirected a palace supply contract to Cassett's business, after discovering that the previous supplier had been systematically underpaying the women who wove the fabric. She was the kind of debt that does not announce itself until it becomes necessary. She looked at Seris standing in her doorway with a sleeping 4-year-old on her shoulder, and whatever she saw in the queen's face required no explanation. "Come in," she said. They sat in Cassett's back office, which smelled of paper and lanolin and the particular dust of a place that stores many things and opens its windows infrequently. Kaylor slept on a pile of folded cloth in the corner, covered with Seris's outer coat. "Diane is dead," Seris said. Cassett's expression did not change visibly, but something behind her eyes recalibrated. "When?" "Last night. The official story is his heart. There was a visitor in palace colors the night before." Cassett absorbed this. "And you had a letter in transit?" "Presumably. Or Diane's response to my letter was intercepted. Either way, someone knows what I was arranging. Which means the northern route is compromised. Potentially, or just watched." Seris laced her fingers on the table. "I need an alternative route. One that doesn't rely on any of the contacts Diane was aware of." "That limits things." "I know." Cassett looked at her steadily. "You understand that if you ask me for this, and I provide it, and whoever sent that visitor traces it back to this building." "I understand," Seris said. "I'm asking anyway because I don't have a better option, and because I think you're capable of making an informed choice about your own risk." Cassett was quiet for a moment. Then she almost smiled. Not warmly, but with the private satisfaction of a person who has seen someone behave consistently with who they believe that person to be. "The Western River route," Cassett said. "There are barge operators on the second canal, not the registered ones, the ones who run under the grain merchant licenses. 4 days to the Marav crossing. From Marav you can reach Eldra Reach by horse in 2 days without touching a single road the palace administration tracks." "What will it cost?" "Nothing you have on you." Cassett paused. "There's a warehouse I've been trying to move for 2 years. Palace zoning restrictions have it tied up. If you ever find yourself in a position where you have the administrative leverage to clear that zoning issue." "If I'm ever in that position," Seris said, "consider it done." Cassett nodded once. Kaylor woke up while they were discussing the logistics. He emerged from the pile of cloth with hair pressed flat on one side and a serious expression that meant he was deciding how he felt about waking up somewhere unfamiliar. He looked at the piles of fabric, then at Cassett, then at his mother. "Are we hiding?" he asked. Seris looked at him. "We're being careful," she said. "Is that the same thing?" "Sometimes," she said. "Come here." He climbed into her lap. She held him with one arm and continued talking to Cassett with the unbroken focus of a woman who has learned to be multiple things simultaneously because survival requires it. This is the particular competence that goes unseen inside palaces, where the people who hold the most threads are rarely the people who sit highest. Seris had spent 6 years developing the organizational architecture of an empire's domestic operations while being perceived as its decorative element. That invisibility had been painful. It was now an asset, because what a palace does not see, a palace cannot account for. She had resources they didn't know she had. She had contacts they hadn't thought to monitor. She had, above all, an understanding of the bureaucratic machinery of Vareth that she had built piece by piece through patient attention, and she intended to use every piece of it. By dusk, she and Kaylor were on a barge moving west on the second canal. The barge smelled of grain and river mud. The operator was a broad-shouldered woman named Tevet, who communicated primarily through nods and who had no apparent interest in who her passengers were or why they needed to be moving before sunrise. Kaylor sat on a wooden crate and watched the city of Vareth slide past in the early evening light. The bridges, the waterside buildings, the torches beginning to appear in windows. "Will we come back?" he asked. "I don't know," Seris said honestly. He considered this. "I liked my room," he said. "It had the good window." "I know. But—" He swung his legs off the crate. "My friend Orem said the best adventures happen when you go somewhere without a plan." "Orem is 6 years old," Seris said. He's very wise for his age, Kaler said. Despite everything, the dead ally, the compromised route, the palace rider who was almost certainly already dispatched to track them, Seris laughed. It was short and real, and it surprised her. He might be right, she said. Kaler looked satisfied with this verdict and went back to watching the city. She watched her son's profile in the fading light and felt the complicated weight of what she had chosen and what had been chosen for him, and the difference between those two things, which was not always clear from inside the moment, but which mattered enormously to the person you became on the other side of it. She had not chosen to be married to Arion. She had not chosen to spend 6 years building a life that was 3/4 performance. She had not chosen to be in a palace when a woman from Arion's past arrived and rearranged the loyalty of every room she walked into. But she had chosen to leave. That was hers. That decision, made in the corridor outside the High Court chamber, belonged to her entirely, and she intended to protect it. The barge moved west. Behind them, in the city, someone had already reported the Queen's carriage rerouting. The information moved through 3 separate channels with the efficiency of a palace that had been built, among other things, to track exactly these kinds of departures. It reached Arion's desk at midnight. He read the courier's report twice. Then he set it down and looked at the wall. She had not taken the northern road. She had not been seen at any of the northern gates. She had effectively vanished from the administrative visibility of his empire. He should have been angry. He knew the shape of what anger felt like in this situation, the hot surge of it, the conviction that vanishing was itself a kind of aggression, the impulse toward force dressed up as authority. He was not angry. He was something he identified slowly and with great resistance, because it was a feeling he had not had cause to practice for the better part of a decade. I was afraid for her, not afraid of what she would do, afraid of what might happen to her in a territory moving through a cold season with a 4-year-old and resources he didn't know the extent of. And this was the part that arrived last, like the final piece of a structure revealing the thing it's been building toward. Afraid. Because whoever had sent that visitor to Dain's study had not done it on his order, which meant there was a force operating inside his palace that he had not authorized, and that force knew his queen's movements. He stood up. He went to find his head of intelligence, a man named Vareth, at midnight, which was the kind of thing that a king does when he has crossed from political calculation into something that bypasses the calculation entirely. Vareth was awake. Men in his position are always awake, or always capable of appearing so. He met Arion in the narrow office off the south corridor, lit by a single lamp. "Lord Dane," Arion said without preamble. Vareth's face was flat and professional. "A tragedy. Tell me who sent the visitor to his study." Vareth's eyes moved fractionally. "My king, the investigation is ongoing." "Vareth!" Arion's voice dropped to the register he used when he meant something irrevocably. "I have been king for 11 years. In that time I have asked you to do things I will not enumerate in any corridor. You owe me the truth when I ask for it directly. Who sent the visitor?" Vareth was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "The commission came through the secondary intelligence channel. The same channel used for..." He stopped. "For what?" "For operations cleared at the advisory level, above my authorization." Arion stared at him. "You're telling me an operation was run inside my intelligence infrastructure, against a nobleman on Vareth soil, without my knowledge, cleared by someone operating at the senior advisory level?" "I'm telling you the commission cleared channels that exist above my sign-off threshold," Vareth said carefully. "I cannot identify the specific source without further investigation." "Then begin the investigation," Arion said. "Tonight." Vareth nodded. Arion turned to leave. "My king." Vareth's voice stopped him. "There is one additional piece of intelligence you should have. The commission, whatever its origin, was not the last order in the sequence." Arion turned back. Vareth met his eyes. "There is a second order outstanding, for the queen." The room was very quiet. Arion's face did not change. Men who have commanded armies learn to receive catastrophic information without visible reaction, because visible reaction in a command structure causes the information to travel before the command does. But his hand, at his side, closed into a fist. "A second order," he said. "Issued from the same channel," Vareth said, "before she left the palace." "What is the nature of the order?" Vareth said it plainly, because that was what the king had asked for. And Vareth was, above all else, a precise man. The nature of the order meant that Seris and Kalor moving through Vareth's territory on a barge on the second canal were not simply fugitives from a political embarrassment, they were targets. And whoever wanted them as targets had done it through the channels of Arion's own intelligence apparatus, using his own administrative infrastructure in his name. The king who had just publicly discarded his queen had become, without knowing it, the instrument of her danger. Arion moved toward the door. "Prepare the fast riders," he said. "Every man who can be on a horse in 10 minutes. I ride with them." Vareth blinked, an unusual expression for him. "My king, if you leave the palace at midnight without announcement, then someone inside this palace," Arion said, "will know that I know." He let that land for exactly a second. "Prepare the horses," he said. He was already walking, outside in the cold corridor, moving with the specific speed of a man who has just understood that he has made an error with lethal consequences. Arion Thorne felt the crown on his skull for the first time as a weight rather than a symbol. Authority, he was learning in real time, does not protect you from the machinery you build in its service. The river was black and cold, and the barge moved through it with the unhurried pace of something that did not know it was running. On its deck, Seris sat with her back against the rail, and Kalor asleep across her legs, watching the dark water move. She did not know about the second order. She did not know about Arion mounting horses in the midnight yard of the Sunless Palace. She knew only the barge, and the cold, and the stars above the river, and the particular quality of silence that exists between what you've left and where you're going. She reached into the bag at her side and found the leather journal. She opened it to the last page she'd written and read the sentence again by the light of the single lantern Tevet had left at the stern. "The woman who survives a king's blindness does not do it by waiting to be seen. She does it by learning to see herself first." She closed the journal. She put her hand on Kalor's back and felt the rise and fall of his breathing, steady and deep. And then, upriver, behind them, from the direction of the city they had left, she heard it. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, many. And they were moving fast. The hoofbeats were not slowing down. Seris put her hand on Tevet's arm before the barge operator could reach for the steering oar. "Don't change your speed," she said quietly. "Don't look back. Keep the same pace." Tevet did not ask questions. That was why Casset had chosen her. Seris shifted Kalor off her legs with the careful deliberateness of a woman performing a task that requires absolute steadiness of hand. He stirred, but did not wake. She set him against the grain sacks, pulled her coat over him, and stood. The hoofbeats were upriver and growing. 4 horses, maybe 5, moving at the kind of speed that means someone has decided that arriving quickly is worth the cost of arriving loudly. The river curved ahead of the barge, which meant whoever was riding would not have a visual line on the water for another 2 minutes. 2 minutes was a number she could work with. She looked at the river banks. The eastern bank was low and brushy, too open. The western bank had the overhanging willows that grew along this stretch of the second canal, thick enough to reduce visibility from the road that ran parallel to the water. "West bank," she said to Tevet, "close as you can get without grounding." Tevet adjusted without a word. The barge moved toward the willow curtain. The hoofbeats crested the curve. Seris crouched beside Kalor, put one hand over his mouth before he could wake and speak, and waited. Through the curtain of willow branches she watched the road. 5 riders. Moving hard. Palace colors on the lead horse. She could see the dark banner even in the moonlight, the silver thread catching. But the formation was wrong for a standard patrol. Too tight, too fast, too purposeful. Not a sweep. A chase. They did not slow at the river. They passed. She watched them until the sound diminished to nothing, and the darkness absorbed the last of the hoof rhythm. Then she exhaled and took her hand from Kalor's face. He blinked up at her with the unfocused alarm of someone dragged back from deep sleep. "Mama." "We're fine," she said. "Go back to sleep." "Were those horses?" "Yes." "Can I see?" "They're gone." He looked disappointed in the specific way of children who have missed something they believe would have been worth being awake for. Then his eyes closed again with the efficiency of the very young, who can recede back into sleep the way water recedes after a wave. Seris stood back up. Her hands were steady. She noted that. Not because it surprised her, but because steadiness requires active maintenance, and she needed to know what her body was still capable of providing. Those riders had not been looking for a barge. They had been riding a road, which meant one of 2 things. The second canal route was not yet compromised, or the people hunting her did not know she had taken water rather than road. Both possibilities had limited lifespans. She stood at the stern in the cold and thought, this is the precise point at which most people collapse, and understanding why requires understanding something fundamental about the nature of threat versus the nature of danger. Threat is announced. It wears colors and makes noise and gives you a target to react to. Danger is different. Danger is quiet and systemic and arrives through channels you trusted, from directions you forgot to watch. The riders on the road were a threat. They were almost manageable for that reason. The danger was what she didn't yet know. The source of the second order. The person inside the palace who had moved against Lord Dane using Arion's own administrative machinery. That person had resources, access, and a timeline she hadn't been given the courtesy of seeing. She pressed her back against the rail and looked at the stars above the river. The hardest thing about surviving intelligent opposition, she had learned, is not the opposition itself. It is the discipline required to resist the instinct to react and instead force yourself to think. Every second spent in pure reaction is a second the opposition's plan advances on its own terms. The only way to break someone else's sequence is to understand it first. Who gained from her removal? Not from Arion choosing Nisara. That was personal. That was history. That was a man making a human error with enormous consequences. That piece she understood. But who gained from her death specifically? From Kaler's absence or death specifically? Kaler's name was the thread she pulled. How was Arion's heir? Legitimate, named, acknowledged. An unchallenged heir made certain kinds of political maneuvering impossible. An heir whose mother was a deposed queen reduced the heir's standing only if that deposition was managed legally and gradually. But an heir who died in transit, away from the palace, under circumstances that could be attributed to the chaos of a queen fleeing an imperial judgment, that heir's absence opened doors. Specifically, it opened the door on who stood next in Vareth's line of succession. She had studied the succession documentation 4 years ago. In the methodical way she studied everything that touched Kaler's future. She retrieved the relevant section now from memory, which was a faculty she had trained the way soldiers train muscle, repeatedly, under pressure, until it stopped requiring effort. Aerion's closest blood relation, aside from Kalor, was his cousin, Vareth Thorn, Lord of the Aldrich territories, a man she had met precisely twice, at formal occasions. A man she had assessed both times with the careful attention she applied to anything that had the potential to become a problem, and had filed away under the category of manageable political peripheral. She had underestimated him. The understanding arrived not as a shock, but as a cold, settling certainty, the way a diagnosis lands when you have already known something was wrong, and simply hadn't named it. Vareth Thorn had this motive. The secondary intelligence channel Varric had identified, the one operating above his sign-off threshold, would trace, she was now almost certain, to an advisory level that Vareth had cultivated over the course of years. Not dramatically, not with the conspicuous energy of someone building a conspiracy. Slowly, patiently, in the way of someone who understands that proximity to power is built incrementally and then used all at once. He had waited for exactly this kind of fracture. A king distracted by personal crisis. A queen politically diminished. A public departure that could be reframed as instability. A sympathetic intelligence network primed to act on orders it believed came from the appropriate level. She was on a barge on a black river with her sleeping child, and a barge operator who owed her a favor, and somewhere in the imperial system, a man was waiting to learn whether his cleanup order had been executed. She had one advantage. He didn't know she knew. Dawn came gray and cold, the light arriving in stages like something cautious, testing the temperature before committing. The barge had moved west through the night without incident. The canal widened here, the banks pulling back, the willows giving way to flat marshland where birds moved in low formations through the mist. Tevitt pointed to a dock structure ahead. 3 rotting posts and a plank wide enough for one person. Oswick's Landing, she said. Grain exchange. We pick up freight here. Seris looked at the landing, then at the tree line beyond it. How long? Half an hour. Maybe less. Tevitt glanced at her with the flat assessment of a woman who trafficked in practical information. There's a man here who knows the Marav crossing better than anyone moving cargo on this canal. If you need a different route to Eldra Reach, I need to send a message, Seris said. Is there anyone at Oswick's Landing who can carry a message to the Sunless Palace without it being seen as having come from me? Tevet considered this for a moment without any visible judgment about the request, which was its own form of professionalism. There's a produce trader named Haas who makes the city run every 3 days. Not today. Day after tomorrow. That's too long. Then you need a different messenger. Tevet tied off the steering rope. The only people moving to the city faster than that are the Imperial grain inspectors. They ride at dawn. Seris looked at the gray sky. The Imperial grain inspectors were palace employees. Using them as couriers meant creating a paper trail that led directly from this location back to whoever reviewed administrative transit logs. But the message she needed to send was not the kind that could wait 2 days, because 2 days was enough time for the second order to find new instruments if the first set of riders had returned empty-handed. She needed Arion to know about Vareth. She hated that. She sat with the specific bitterness of it, while Tevet moved the barge against the dock and looped the rope around the post. She was about to ask a favor from the man who had publicly discarded her. Not because she trusted him, not because she had revised her assessment of what he had done, but because Marathorn's play required Arion's blindness to succeed, and Arion was the only instrument in sufficient proximity to the source of the threat to act on it quickly. She was going to use her estranged king to protect her son from a threat her estranged king didn't know existed. The irony was not lost on her. It was just not relevant enough to spend time on. She found a piece of waxed paper in Tevet's cargo manifest kit and a stub of marking chalk. She wrote 8 lines, no names she didn't have to use, no location, just the sequence of facts as she had assembled them, clean and specific, the way you write something for a reader who needs to understand quickly and act immediately. At the bottom, she wrote one sentence that was not a fact but a command. Find Vareth's second channel source before it finds us. She did not sign it. He would know her handwriting. Huss the produce trader was not at Oswick's Landing. His cousin was, a young man named Deal with bad posture and quick eyes, who listened to Seris's request with the expressions of someone doing rapid internal math about personal risk versus personal gain. She did not offer him money. She offered him something more durable, a specific contact name inside the Palace Merchant Administration, someone who could expedite the renewal of Haas's distribution license, which Deal confirmed was coming up for its triennial review. Deal took the folded paper and tucked it inside his jacket without looking at it. This goes directly to the king, she said, not to a steward, not to an administrative office. The king's hand. I know a stable boy, Deal said. He delivers morning feed to the royal stable personally, has access to the east corridor. How reliable is he? Deal shrugged. He's my brother. She studied him for a moment, then she nodded. She went back to the barge. Kyler was awake, sitting on the grain sacks, eating a piece of dried fruit that Tevet had produced from somewhere, examining his surroundings with the interested, untroubled expression of someone on an adventure. That man had very bad posture, Kaelor observed as Seris climbed back aboard. He did, she agreed. My instructor says posture is the first language a person speaks. He considered his own spine and made a visible adjustment. Is that true? It's useful, she said, like most things your instructor says. He also says that a person who can't sit still can't think straight. Kaelor frowned. But I think some of my best thinking happens when I'm moving. Seris looked at her son, 4 years old, with Arion's jaw and her eyes, and a mind that moves sideways through problems in a way that was entirely his own. That's something worth knowing about yourself, she said, that your thinking works a certain way. Most people don't figure that out until they're much older. He seemed satisfied with this and returned to the dried fruit. She sat beside him and watched the mist lift off the marshland and thought about what came next, which was the only productive place her mind could go. The message was sent. That was one thread. The Marav crossing was 4 days away by barge, 2 more by horse. 6 days in open territory. 6 days during which the Second Order was still active, and she had no way of knowing whether Deal's brother had actually put the paper in Arion's hand, or whether the whole chain had broken somewhere she couldn't see. She needed a contingency that did not rely on Arion. She sat with that and built it piece by piece, the way she had built everything necessary in her life. Without fanfare, without announcing the construction, simply laying one stone after another until there was something you could stand on. In the Sunless Palace, the message arrived at the wrong time. Arion had ridden through most of the night with 5 of his most trusted riders, sweeping the northern roads without result, before Vareth's second dispatch reached him near the city's outer limits with a single line. The Queen did not take the northern gate. She is not on any tracked road. He had turned back. He had returned to the palace at dawn with mud on his boots, and the particular cold fury of a man who has run hard in the wrong direction. Nisara was not awake when he arrived. He did not go to her chambers. He went to the intelligence office and sat across from Vareth in the gray morning light and demanded the investigation's progress. Vareth's progress was a name, not Mareth Thorn. Not yet. What Vareth had was a signature, a specific authorization code that appeared in the secondary channel's activation record, a code that had been issued 18 months prior to an advisory-level administrator named Kossel, who served on the Territorial Governance Board, and who had, Vareth now confirmed, maintained a correspondence with Lord Mareth Thorn's Aldrich estate throughout the past 2 years. It was circumstantial. It was also the kind of circumstantial that stops being theoretical the moment you understand the motivation. Arion listened to Vareth lay out the chain without interrupting. When Vareth finished, Arion sat in the silence for a moment. This is where the nature of the alpha fracture becomes most visible and most instructive. The conventional wisdom about strength holds that a powerful man's greatest test is an external enemy, a rival, an army, a usurper wearing an honest face. But this is wrong. The most lethal tests of a ruler's character are not external at all. They are internal, systemic, and self-generated. Mareth Thorn had not built his network against Arion. He had built it within Arion's own administrative structure, feeding on the exact blind spots that absolute authority creates. A king who does not question his own apparatus becomes, inevitably, a king who cannot see his apparatus acting against him until the action is nearly complete. Arion had built an empire on the principle that loyalty purchased through power is loyalty sufficient. He was now sitting in the evidence of that principle's catastrophic limitation. Kossel, he said. In the Eastern Chancery, Vareth said, available for questioning. No. Arion stood up. If Kossel is questioned and Mareth learns of it before we have everything we need, the secondary channel goes dark, and we lose the thread. He thought for a moment. Put someone on Kossel who Kossel doesn't know. Watch where he goes, who he contacts. Don't move on him yet. And Lord Mareth. Not yet, Arion said again, with the precision of a man constructing a trap rather than reacting to one. If Mareth knows the riders returned empty-handed, his next move tells us what he has left to use. We let him make it. Vareth nodded slowly, with the expression of a man who respects the logic, and is also aware of its cost. The Queen is in open territory, my king. If the Second Order has alternative instruments, find her, Arion said. Every contact she has outside the palace, every name that appears in her correspondence over the last 2 years. Build the map of where she might be going and find the route she's most likely using. He moved toward the door. She is not a secondary consideration in this. She is the primary one. If Mareth succeeds in executing that second order, the sequence he's built becomes irreversible. Vareth looked at him carefully. Understood, my king. Arion stopped in the doorway. And Vareth? His voice was different now, stripped of the operational register, the voice of someone who is also just a person. She has my son with her. Whatever else is true, she took him to keep him safe. That is the action of someone protecting the most important thing in that palace from something she understood before I did. Vareth said nothing, because there was nothing to add. Don't lose her, Arion said. It was at the Marev crossing, on the 3rd day, that the plan cracked. The barge had made good time. The canal narrowed near the Marev junction, and the current strengthened. Tevet read the water, with the accuracy of someone who had spent 30 years learning to trust it. They arrived at the junction at midday, in weak sunlight, with the Marev village visible on the far bank, and the horse trader's operation Casset had described identifiable by the fenced paddock and the smell. Seris was helping Kaeler off the barge when Tevet said, flatly and without inflection, "Don't look at the road. 2 riders. They've been parked at the crossroads since before we came around the last bend." Seris did not look at the road. She helped Kaelor onto the dock and kept her body turned toward the barge, adjusting the bag on her shoulder with the unhurried movement of a freight passenger dealing with cargo. "Palace colors," Tevet said. "Positioned or patrolling?" "Positioned. They haven't moved." Positioned meant they were waiting for something specific. Either they had been told to hold the Marev crossing on the off chance a queen came through, which was a broad net, or they had information that pointed specifically here. She thought about Deal and his brother the stable boy, and the specific chain of trust she had constructed from limited materials in a short window. She thought about the word contingency. Tevet, she said quietly, can you take the barge past the junction without stopping? Continue south on the main canal. I can. What's south? Ferris Mill, 2 hours. What's at Ferris Mill? Grain storage. A tavern. A road that goes east toward the Keld Mountains. Not the route I need, she said. No, Tevet agreed, but it's a road those riders don't know you're taking. Seris looked at Kaylor, who was examining the dock planks with focused interest, pressing one board with his foot to see how much it would flex. Kaylor, she said, back on the barge. He looked up. But the horses are over there. We'll see horses later. How much later? Later enough, she said. Come. He looked at her face and read it with the accuracy of a child who has learned that certain tones of voice mean a negotiation is not available. He came back aboard without argument. The barge moved past the Marav Junction. Neither rider on the road looked at them, or rather, one did not look. The other watched the barge for approximately 4 seconds with the attention of someone checking against a description rather than simply watching river traffic. Seris kept her back to the road. 4 seconds. Then the rider looked away. She exhaled once she could feel the junction behind them. What she did not know, and would not know until it was too late to prevent it, was that the rider who had watched for 4 seconds had already seen enough. Not her face, she had kept that angled away. But the child. A boy of approximately 4 years old, dark hair, sitting on the grain sacks at the stern of a canal barge moving south past the Marav crossing. The rider turned his horse. He did not pursue the barge. He rode in the other direction, back toward the relay station 3 miles east, where a dispatch line ran directly to the Aldrich territories. The message he sent was short. 6 words that confirmed the sequence Vareth Thorn had been tracking from the moment Kossel activated the secondary channel. The Queen missed the first net. She is south. And in the Aldrich estate, a man who had spent 2 years building toward exactly this moment received those 6 words and made a decision that moved the problem from passive to active. He sent a different kind of rider. Not palace colors. Not imperial administrative infrastructure. Personal men. His own. The kind who operated outside the systems Vareth could monitor. 4 of them. Armed with the specific brief that this was not a question of apprehension. They rode at dusk, when the light makes distance deceptive and speeds difficult to judge. At Ferris Mill, 2 hours south, Seris stepped off the barge onto a dock that smelled of rotting grain and riverweed, with Kaylor on her hip and her bag on her shoulder, and the cold certainty that the Marav deflection had bought her time, but not safety. She needed a horse. She needed a road. And she needed, for the first time since the carriage had left the Sunless Palace, to admit to herself that she was operating at the edge of what she could hold alone. That admission cost her nothing. She had never confused pride with capability. She asked Tevet one last question before the barge moved on. If you were running, she said, and you needed to disappear completely from every route a palace administration might track, where would you go? Tevet coiled the rope with practiced hands and considered this with the seriousness of someone who understands that hypothetical questions from people in genuine danger are never actually hypothetical. There's a woman, Tevet said, in the Keld foothills. She's been running people through the mountain passes since before your husband's father was king. She doesn't ask names, she doesn't take messages. You just arrive and tell her the river sent you. Who is she? Tevet shook her head once. She's just the woman in the Keld foothills. A pause. But she's never lost anyone she's moved. Not once. Seris looked at the road east. The Keld foothills. 2 days on horseback in good conditions. Unknown conditions on a mountain route being watched by people with better resources than she currently had. She set Kaylor on his feet. We need a horse, she told him. He looked at her with the absolute willingness of someone whose trust in a person is not contingent on circumstances. Finally, he said. She might have smiled at that under different conditions. She took his hand. She turned east. And behind her, closing at the speed of dusk, men who answered to Vareth Thorn moved through the fading light on horses that had not been ridden gently. She had perhaps 6 hours, possibly less. And for the first time since she had walked out of the Sunless Palace with her son's hand in hers, Seris Vale understood with bone-deep clarity that composure and capability, though necessary, were not going to be sufficient. What came next required something she had spent years refusing to become. A woman who could be dangerous. The horse she found at Ferris Mill was not a good horse. It was a broad, thick-legged animal, the color of river mud, built for pulling grain wagons rather than covering ground. And it cost her the last piece of jewelry she carried, a copper bracelet with a green stone that had belonged to her mother and which she handed to the trader at the mill yard without hesitation, because sentiment is a weight that a person running cannot afford to carry. She put Kalor in front of her in the saddle. He gripped the pommel with both hands and sat very straight, which she recognized as his attempt to be helpful by being as small and balanced as possible. That recognition moved through her chest and she put it away, because emotion is another weight, and she needed everything available for other purposes. She rode east. The road was rutted and narrow, more track than road, running alongside a low stone fence that marked the boundary of fallow farmland. The light was fading with the speed that winter light dies, not gradually, but in stages, each one dimmer than the previous, with no gentle transition between them. She pushed the horse harder than its temperament appreciated, and it complained about this through its gait without actually refusing, which was the best arrangement she could negotiate under the circumstances. 6 hours, maybe less. She thought about the woman in the Keld foothills and what Tevet had said. She's never lost anyone she's moved, not once. In a world of uncertain instruments, that sentence was the closest thing to reliable she had encountered since Lord Dain died. She thought about Mareth Thorn and what his men would look like when they came, not palace riders. Personal men, she was certain of that now. Men whose employment existed outside the documented structures of the imperial administration. The kind who are paid specifically because they are deniable, which meant they would not be wearing colors. They would look like travelers until they did not. She thought about becoming dangerous. That was the thing she kept returning to, with the specific discomfort of a thought you cannot put down because the thing it requires of you is something you have constructed your entire identity against. For 6 years she had survived inside the Sunless Palace through intelligence, patience, and the cultivated appearance of harmlessness. She had made herself so precisely unalarming that the people who should have been watching her had never thought to. That invisibility was her armor, and it had served her with extraordinary consistency. But invisibility requires a stable environment. You cannot be invisible and also moving fast through open country with a 4-year-old on a wagon horse, being tracked by men who are not using administrative channels, and therefore cannot be deflected by administrative intelligence. In a different kind of danger, you need a different kind of person. She was riding east and thinking about who that person would have to be when the first sound reached her. Not hoofbeats yet, but something earlier than hoofbeats. The quality of the silence changing on her left flank. The way birds in the hedgerow went quiet, in a sequence that moved from south to north, tracking something moving parallel to the road in the field beyond the stone fence. She did not look. She pressed her heels into the horse's sides and felt the animal's surprised acceleration beneath her. Kalor grabbed the pommel tighter without being told. Good boy, she thought. She did not say it aloud because she needed her breath for other things. The road curved north ahead, which was the wrong direction. She needed east, and the track that ran east was half a mile ahead at the junction marked, Cassett had told her, by a broken mill wheel propped against an elm tree. She had been watching for it. She was watching for it now with an urgency that narrowed her entire world to the strip of road ahead. The silence to her left continued moving. Then it stopped. That was worse. A stopped silence means something has made a decision. She heard the fence before she saw the man, the crack of stone on stone as a boot found purchase on the low wall, and then he was over it and on the road in front of her, and the horse screamed and reared, and she had one arm around Kalor and the other on the reins, and the horse's front hooves came down hard and wrong on the road surface, and they were sideways, and then she was off. She hit the ground with her shoulder, not her head. That was a choice she made in the half-second of falling, twisting her body deliberately, so Kalor went with her controlled rather than separate and falling alone. He hit her ribs and not the road. She heard the air leave her lungs in one complete exhalation, and then there was cold dirt against her cheek, and the horse was somewhere to her right, making the sound horses make when they are frightened, and the man on the road was walking toward her. She got up. Not gracefully. She got her knees under her and then her feet, and she was upright before the man was close enough to reach her, which was the only metric that mattered. Kalor was on his feet beside her. She did not look at him. She looked at the man. It was broad and unhurried, wearing a road coat with no colors, carrying a short blade at his belt that had not been drawn yet. Behind him, from the field beyond the fence, 2 more men were crossing the stone wall. One to the right, moving to cut off the road ahead. One more behind her. She heard him without turning. the specific rhythm of boots on packed earth. 4, the rider's message had said. She had accounted for 3. The 4th was still somewhere she hadn't located. "My queen," the broad man said. Not a greeting, a confirmation. He was checking his information against the things standing in front of him. She said nothing. "The boy comes with us," he said. "You—" A pause, not cruelty, just procedure. "You don't need to come further than this road." What happens to a person in the moment? They understand they are standing between their child and death is not what stories typically describe. Stories describe a surge of rage, or a crystallization of purpose, or some heroic ignition of will. The reality is colder and faster and more mechanical than that. The body does not wait for the mind to compose its response. The body simply begins making survival decisions, and the mind catches up afterward. Her mind caught up to the fact that she had already calculated the distance to the broad man, the angle required, and the specific vulnerability of someone who has not yet drawn their weapon, because they do not believe the thing in front of them constitutes a threat. She was that comfortable assumption. She intended to correct it. She stepped toward him rather than back, which was not what he expected, and in the fraction of a second his expectations required to revise themselves. She had her hand on his wrist below the belt knife and her knee in the correct place, and he went down with the loud, surprised noise of a man whose body has been leveraged against itself before his mind could authorize the appropriate response. The blade came free in her hand. She put Kaelor directly behind her and turned to face the 2 men coming from the right. This is the moment that defines something essential about human capacity, and it is worth pausing inside it to understand what it actually means. Not the violence of it. The violence is incidental. What matters is the architecture beneath the action. Seris Vale was not a fighter in any trained technical sense. What she had was something that training alone cannot manufacture. The absolute clarity of someone who has removed every consideration except one. When a person, any person, strips their decision-making to a single axis, they become capable of things that would be physically or psychologically inaccessible to them under normal conditions. The mechanism is not courage. Courage is for people who have a choice about their fear. This was something past courage. This was the territory where survival stops being a preference and becomes the only metabolic function still running. The 2 men from the right were faster than the broad man had been, and they were not surprised. The first one hit her hard on the left shoulder, the bad shoulder she'd landed on, and the pain was a white spike that ran from the joint to the base of her skull. She kept her feet. The blade she'd taken was in her right hand, and she used the flat of it against the man's forearm to break his grip on her arm before he could complete it, which bought her 1 second, which was enough to put herself at an angle that made it difficult for both men to reach her simultaneously. Behind her, she could hear Kaelor breathing, fast and deliberate, not crying, which meant he was running on some ancestral version of the same mechanism she was running on. The man behind her had closed the distance. She could hear it. She could not fight 4 men. She knew this with complete clarity, the same clarity she applied to everything. She was upright and moving and had a blade she hadn't been stabbed with yet, but 4 men is 4 men, and physics does not negotiate. What she needed was time. Specifically, she needed time in the next 30 seconds that she could not generate herself. What she got was hoofbeats. Not from the east, from the north. Hard and fast, multiple horses, coming around the road's curve at a speed that announced purpose rather than patrol. All 4 of Mareth's men heard it simultaneously. The broad man had gotten back to his feet. He looked north. Then he looked at the 2 men flanking her. Then he made a calculation, and she watched him make it. The math of how much his employer's instructions were worth against what was coming around that curve. He took 2 steps back. It was not a retreat. It was a reset. Whatever was coming around that curve, he intended to assess it before recommitting. What came around the curve was Arion Thorn, King Alpha of Vareth, on a black horse with 4 riders behind him, riding like a man who has made his peace with the possibility that arriving on time may not be arriving on time. He pulled up hard when the scene in front of him resolved. The horse skidded in the loose road surface, haunches dropping, and Arion was out of the saddle before it had fully stopped moving, which was a thing she had seen him do on military exercises, and had thought then was theater, but was apparently just a thing his body did when it had decided to move faster than the horse. He saw her. He saw the blade in her hand. He saw Kaelor behind her. He saw the 4 men, the broad one now holding his side where she had done the damage. all of them repositioning with the unhurried recalculation of men who are not afraid of arriving reinforcements, but are doing the math on whether the math still works. Aryon's 4 riders spread across the road without being told, which is what competent men do when their king has just dismounted into a situation with 4 armed unknowns. The broad man looked at Aryon for a long moment. "Palace business," the broad man said. "No," Aryon said. His voice was the voice he used when a conversation had already ended before it started. "It isn't." "Lord Vareth is under investigation for treason," Aryon said. "You can tell him that, or you can stay here and we can discuss it at length. But if you put your hand on that knife in the next 3 seconds, I will save Vareth the administrative cost of a trial." There is a specific quality of threat that is distinguishable from performance, and everyone on that road heard which one this was. The broad man looked at the riders, looked at Aryon, made the final version of the calculation. He walked into the field. His 3 men followed without discussion. Aryon watched until they were over the fence and into the dark beyond. Then he turned and looked at Seris. She was still holding the blade. Her shoulder was on fire. She could feel her heartbeat in it, a separate, louder rhythm underneath the main one. Her coat was torn at the sleeve and there was blood on her hand from where the second man's grip had dragged across her palm, and she was breathing with the controlled deliberateness of someone managing pain through mechanics rather than feeling. She was the most composed person on that road. He crossed the distance between them in 4 strides and stopped a foot from her, close enough that she could see his face clearly in what remained of the light. And what she saw there was not the king. It was something underneath the king. A man who had ridden through the night and most of 2 days on incomplete information and arrived at a cold road in the Keld foothills to find his queen standing over one of his cousin's hired men with a blade she'd taken by hand. He looked at her like a man looking at evidence that overturns everything he thought he understood about a situation. "Are you hurt?" he said. "My shoulder," she said. "It's manageable." He looked at the blood on her hand. "That's also manageable," she said. He breathed out slowly. Then he crouched down to Kalor, who was standing exactly where Seris had put him, with an expression that had passed through fear and come out somewhere on the other side. The face of a child who has just experienced something large enough to rearrange his internal map of the world. "Hey," Aryon said. Kalor looked at him. "Are you all right?" Kalor considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I fell when the horse went sideways," he said. "But Mama caught me. So, mostly." Aryon put his hand briefly on the back of the boy's head. Then he stood back up. He and Seris looked at each other in the cold. 6 years of marriage, a public discarding, a dead ally, a secondary order, 4 men on a road, and a blade she'd taken by hand. All of it existing simultaneously in the space between them. "Vareth," she said. "I know," he said. "Vareth traced the authorization chain. I have men at the Aldrich estate as of this morning. Your message took too long to reach you." "My message?" He stopped. "You sent the message." "Through a produce trader's brother at Ferris Mill." She watched his face process this. "How did you find us?" "Deal," he said. "The produce trader." He sent a second message to Vareth's contact at the palace merchant office, because... He paused. He said the queen seemed like someone worth 2 messages. She filed that away. She would find a way to make Deal's distribution license the easiest renewal in Vareth's administrative history. "The riders at the Marev crossing were yours," she said. "Vareth's. Watching the crossings. I didn't authorize them to intercept." He looked at her steadily. "I authorized them to observe and protect. The instruction was specific. One of them reported south to Mareth's relay station. He may have been doubled." Aryon's jaw tightened. "Name?" "I don't have a name. But the barge passed the Marev junction and one rider watched for 4 seconds too long before turning east instead of continuing the patrol." He turned to his riders. "Marev junction. Vareth's man assigned there. Pull him for questioning." One of them peeled off the road without a word. She watched the rider go. This is the thing about people who are genuinely competent under pressure. They do not waste the pressure. Every second of urgency is a second that shows you exactly who a person is beneath the accretion of normal conditions. She had just watched Aryon receive new intelligence, assess it, prioritize correctly, and act in the time it took most people to decide whether the situation required action at all. She had forgotten he could do that. Or rather, she had known it in the abstract, the way you know things about a person you have stopped truly watching. Seeing it happen in real time with her son's safety as the relevant metric was different from knowing it. She did not soften toward him for it, but she cataloged it with the scrupulousness she applied to all accurate information. "We need shelter," she said, "and a physician for the shoulder." "There's a garrison at Keld's Edge," he said, "half an hour north." Mareth's men were 4. They may have more in this territory. "I have 8 riders," he said, "and I know Mareth's operational resources better than he thinks I do." A pause. "He's been building toward this for 2 years. Now that it's exposed, he has nothing left to deploy, except men who will be figuring out in the next few hours that their employer is finished." She looked at him. "You're certain?" "I'm certain enough to move, which is the only kind of certain that matters on a road in the dark." She glanced at Kaelor, who had moved to the horse she'd arrived on and was examining it with the focused assessment of someone who has opinions about horses and is forming new ones. The animal had calmed. Animals calm when the immediate threat resolves and the scene goes quiet. Children take longer. She made the decision. "North," she said. They moved. The garrison at Keld's Edge was a minor installation. 12 soldiers, a commanding officer named Brain, who had the bearing of a career military man who had been overlooked for advancement long enough to become either bitter or philosophical about it, and had chosen philosophical, and a physician who served the garrison and 2 nearby settlements, and who looked at Seris's shoulder with the focused displeasure of someone who takes damage to a joint personally. "Displaced," the physician said. "Not a question." "Said it," Seris said. "You should lie down for—" "Said it now, please." The physician looked at her, then at the king, who was standing in the doorway of the small medical room. "Give us the room," Seris said to Arion. He left without arguing. The setting of the shoulder was the worst 2 seconds she had experienced in a day that had contained a number of candidates for that distinction. She made one sound and then she was done with making sounds, and the physician wrapped the joint with the speed of someone who had done this many times and had been told once was enough. She breathed through the wrapping. On the other side of the door she could hear Kaelor talking to someone. One of the riders, she thought, based on the one-sided quality of the conversation. Kaelor's voice had the recovered animation of someone who has processed enough fear that the other end of it is starting to look like an adventure. She needed that. She needed her son to be on the other side of tonight with the fundamental understanding that the world was navigable intact. She would build that. Whatever came next, she would build that first. The physician finished the wrapping and gave her a vial of something for the pain that she put in her coat pocket without taking. She went back out. Arion was in the garrison's main room, standing near the fire with a cup of something hot, and his back to the door, looking at the fire the way men look at fires when they are not looking at fires. Commander Brain was elsewhere with the discretion of a career soldier who has learned to find reasons to be in other rooms. Kaelor was asleep on a cot in the corner, wrapped in a military blanket, one arm around the grain sack pillow someone had thought to provide. She stood at the door and looked at her sleeping son for a moment. Then she crossed the room and stood near the fire, not near Arion. The warmth was necessary, and she was going to let herself have it without the complication of proximity. He heard her come in. He didn't turn right away. When he did, he looked at the wrapped shoulder, then at her face. "You need to sleep," he said. "I need to talk to you," she said, "and then I need to sleep." He waited. She organized what she intended to say with the efficiency of someone who has been composing it for 3 days, across a canal barge and a bad horse and a road in the dark, and who is done waiting for the right moment, because the right moment is a fiction invented by people who have the luxury of waiting. "What happened between us," she said, "is not something I'm here to relitigate. You made your decisions. I made mine. What happened tonight on that road has not changed what happened in the High Court chamber. I want that clear." "It's clear," he said. "But Kaelor's safety has to be a separate matter from the state of our marriage. Those 2 things cannot be allowed to become entangled in a way that makes either of us use one as a lever against the other. He is too young and too important for that." "I agree," he said. "Mareth needs to be handled completely. Not politically managed, not shuffled to an administrative consequence. Completely. The secondary channel, the advisors he cultivated, the men on that road tonight. If any of those threads are left intact, Kaelor has a vulnerability that I can't protect from wherever I end up living, and you can't protect from inside a palace that Mareth spent 2 years infiltrating." "I know," he said. "Vareth has the thread. I intend to pull it all the way." "Good." She shifted the shoulder carefully. I will give Vareth a written account of everything I observed from the time the message went to Diane through tonight on the road. Names, timings, the chain as I assembled it. That's my contribution to the investigation, and it ends there. I am not going to be a tool in your political house cleaning. I'm giving you information because it helps Kaylor, not because it helps you. Something crossed his face that was too complicated to name quickly. I understand the distinction, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. This is the specific anguish of two people who were not wrong about each other in the ways that would make clean separation possible. He was not a bad man. She had never believed he was. He was a man who had made bad choices in the specific way that power enables, by allowing certainty to substitute for attention, by treating devotion as a structural feature rather than a living thing that requires tending. Those are not villainous failures. They are human ones, which is almost worse, because human failures cannot be assigned to something external and then dismissed. She had loved him, and he had not been able to see her clearly enough to protect what she offered him. He had lost her, and the loss had taught him something that no amount of her patience over 6 years had been able to teach, because loss operates on a different mechanism than presence. Presence can be adapted to, cataloged, taken for granted. Loss cannot. Loss arrives with no context that makes it comfortable and stays until you understand it. She could see that he understood it now. It did not change what she needed. I'm not coming back to the palace, she said. He was quiet. Not as queen, not in any formal capacity. She kept her voice level, not cold. What I told you in the court, that forgiveness is not surrender, that's still true. I can forgive you for what happened in the high court. I already have, in the ways that matter to me. But forgiveness doesn't rebuild what was there, and I have no interest in rebuilding it. I have an interest in building something new, somewhere I choose, on terms I set. He looked at the fire for a moment. When he looked back at her, his face had the expression she had seen on the road. Underneath the king, the man who had ridden hard through the dark and arrived not as a ruler executing authority, but as something older and more basic. Kaylor, he said. Will know his father, she said. I won't take that from him. He's going to need you when he's old enough to understand what you are and what this empire is. I won't be the thing that stands between them. A pause. But he stays with me, at least until he's old enough to decide for himself. Where? Eldra Reach, she said. It's still the plan. He nodded slowly. I'll make sure the provincial administration knows you're under imperial protection. No one moves against you in that territory without moving against my authority. I'll accept that, she said, not gratefully, practically. He looked at her for a long moment, with the full attention she had spent 6 years watching him offer to everything except her, and which arrived now too late and too complete to be anything except painful. I should have looked at you, he said, the way I'm looking at you right now. I should have done that when it still changed something. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. You should have. She did not offer comfort. She did not soften it. The truth was the truth, and he had asked for the honest version, and she was not in the business of revising reality to make the people who had failed her feel better about what they'd done. But she also did not turn away from him, because he was the father of her son, and that fact required something from her even now, and she was not made of concrete. She was made of the same complicated human material as everyone else on that road, and underneath everything she was also just tired and cold, and her shoulder ached, and she was grateful, in the specific private way she allowed herself to be grateful for things she hadn't expected, that he had ridden through the dark and arrived in time. She would keep that to herself. She went to the cot beside her son's and lay down with her coat pulled over her and her eyes open, looking at the garrison's stone ceiling. Arion stayed at the fire. She fell asleep before she heard him move. The morning came clear and brutally cold, with frost on the garrison windows and the kind of light that finds every edge it can. Vareth's riders arrived at the garrison at first light, with a dispatch that Arion read standing in the yard while his breath made clouds in the cold air. Commander Brain stood at a discreet distance. Arion read the dispatch twice. Then he stood very still for a moment, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man recalibrating a sequence he believed he had understood. He went inside and found Seris at the table with Kaylor, eating whatever the garrison's kitchen could produce on short notice, which was apparently porridge and dried meat, and Kaylor's opinion of this combination, clearly stated for anyone in the room. She looked up when Arion came in. She read his face in the half-second the way she had always read it, the way she would apparently always be able to read it regardless of the state of the marriage. What happened? She said. He set the dispatch on the table between them. She read it. Her face did not change while she was reading. That was the discipline of 6 years, and it did not fail her. But when she looked up, her eyes were very still in the specific way that stillness looks when it is being maintained against a significant internal pressure. Vareth Thorn had not been at the Aldrich estate when Varrich's men arrived. He had left 2 days prior. His last confirmed location was the western checkpoint at Vareth's outer provincial limit. The western checkpoint opened onto the road that ran through Ferris Mill, through the Marv Junction, through the Keld foothills, and the dispatch from Varrich's man at the western checkpoint confirmed the party Vareth had ridden with, 6 personal men, had passed through 3 days ago and had not been seen returning. He was not at the Aldrich estate waiting to learn the outcome of the second order. He was in the field. He was, by the calculation of road speeds and days traveled, somewhere within a radius that the garrison at Keld's Edge sat near the center of. He had not sent 4 men. He had sent 4 men first, and he had followed them personally, with 6 more, because Vareth Thorn had spent 2 years building toward a specific outcome and had reached the point where he was not willing to trust it to anyone else. Seris put the dispatch on the table. She looked at Kaler, who was eating his porridge and dissecting the dried meat with the investigative focus of a child who needs to understand what he's eating before he commits to eating it. She looked at the garrison's 4 walls, 12 soldiers, 8 of Arian's riders, minus the one sent to the Marv Junction, a physician, a commander, a stone building at the edge of a road in the Keld foothills, and somewhere outside in the cold morning, a man with 6 armed personal retainers who had committed to the kind of action that cannot be undone and had therefore committed to its completion. She looked at Arian. He was already looking at her. "He's going to come here," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Arian said. "He's going to come here." The fire in the garrison hearth burned steady. Outside, in the frost and the early light, the road from the west was still empty. Not for long. The road from the west stayed empty for 40 minutes. Arian used every one of them. He moved through the garrison with the focused economy of a man who has stopped calculating odds and started calculating positions, which is what happens when a commander accepts that the situation is going to become physical regardless of what he prefers. He spoke to Commander Brain in short sentences. He repositioned the 8 riders he had into a configuration that accounted for the garrison's 2 external approaches. He put 2 men on the garrison roof with longbows and clear sight lines to the western road. He moved the physician and Kalor to the garrison's stone storage room at the rear, which had 1 door and no windows, and was therefore the most defensible interior space in the building. Kalor went without protest, which told Seris that the boy understood something large was happening, even if he didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. He held the physician's hand and looked back at his mother from the doorway of the storage room with the expression she had seen on his face exactly once before. The morning after a storm had blown out the nursery window at the palace, when he had stood in the draft looking at the broken glass with the particular stillness of a child learning that the world can change its shape overnight. She held his gaze for a moment. "I'll be right here," she said. He nodded once, with a gravity that was too old for his face, and went inside. The door closed. She turned back to the garrison's main room. Arian was at the window, watching the road. She crossed to stand beside him, which was a decision she made without deliberating over it, because deliberating over proximity was a luxury for people not currently waiting for 6 armed men to arrive. They stood at the window together and watched the empty road. "You should be in the storage room," he said. "You should have 12 more men," she said. "We're both working with what we have." He looked at her sidelong. She kept her eyes on the road. "If it goes badly," he said. "It won't." "Seris, tell me what you need me to do," she said. "Not where to go, what to do." A pause. He understood the distinction. The back passage. If they breach the front and push through, the back passage runs north along the wall to the stable. Take Kalor and Brain's fastest horse and ride north. Don't stop for anything. "And you?" He didn't answer that. She looked at him then. His profile in the thin morning light was the profile of a man who has organized everything around a central point, and the central point is not himself. She recognized the architecture of that. She had lived inside a version of it for 6 years. The irony was not lost on her that she could recognize it now, in him, at this particular moment. "Don't do something irreversible on my account," she said. "Everything I'm doing right now is on Vareth's account," he said. Mareth moves against the crown's heir. That's the legal basis. That's what this is. Is it? He was quiet for 3 seconds. No, he said. It isn't only that. She looked back at the road. The empty road chose that moment to stop being empty. They came out of the tree line on the western side, not from the road itself, which meant Mareth had scouted the garrison's sightlines before committing, a level of tactical preparation that confirmed what she had already assessed. This was not a man making a desperate move. This was a man executing a plan he had rehearsed. 6 men in road coats, no colors, moving in a spread formation that covered the width of the approach, which made archery complicated and a frontal response from the garrison gate suicidal. And behind them, on a gray horse, riding at the measured pace of someone for whom urgency is a thing other people feel, Vareth Thorn. She had met him twice. Both times she had catalogued him as a peripheral political risk and moved on. She was revising that assessment now in real time, watching him ride. He was perhaps 50, with the lean frame of a man who had stayed active through the years when comfort tends to claim people. He rode with the ease of someone who grew up on horseback in the Aldrich territories and never stopped. His face at this distance was a pale shape beneath gray hair, but even at distance she could read the posture. Not tense, not urgent, patient. He was patient because he believed the sequence had already concluded in his favor. He believed 4 men in a cold road had handled the problem. He was arriving to confirm the outcome and to deal with whatever remained, which in his calculation was a king separated from his palace and his administrative apparatus, in a minor garrison, with fewer men than him. He was, she thought, about to have an unpleasant revision. Arion moved away from the window. He walked to the garrison door and opened it himself, which was a thing his riders had clearly not expected him to do, based on the speed with which 2 of them moved to flank him. He stepped outside into the cold morning air, onto the garrison's packed earthyard, and stood in the open. Seris watched from the window. This is what actual authority looks like, stripped of throne rooms and ceremony and the accumulated theater of governance. A man standing in a yard, in the cold, making himself visible to people who have come to remove him. Not because he believes visibility is safe, because he understands that certain confrontations can only be resolved by the people at the center of them being present at the center of them, and sending proxies is a language that only works when both parties agree to speak it. Vareth Thorn pulled his horse up at the edge of the yard. His 6 men stopped behind him and spread in a loose arc. Arion's 2 bowmen on the roof had arrows nocked. The 4 riders in the yard had hands near belts. Nobody moved. The morning was very quiet. "Cousin," Arion said. Vareth looked at him with the expression of a man encountering a surprise that requires real-time integration. The 4 men he had sent to the road in the dark had not returned to him with a report. He had been operating on the assumption of a completed second order and a chaotic aftermath. What was in front of him instead was a king standing upright in a garrison yard with 8 armed men. He recovered quickly. Seris noted that. He was intelligent. Intelligent opponents are more dangerous but also more predictable, because they make their decisions based on logic rather than panic, and logic can be anticipated. "You're a long way from the Sunless Palace," Vareth said. "So are you," Arion said. "A long way from the Aldrich estate." "I was concerned for the welfare of my queen," Vareth said, the language of a man falling back to a defensible political position. Hearing that she had left the palace under distressing circumstances, a loyal subject of the crown feels compelled to act. "Through the secondary intelligence channel," Arion said, "using Cossel's authorization code, issuing operational orders for actions on Vareth soil against a nobleman and the crown's heir." Vareth's face did not move. "That's a specific accusation," he said. "Vareth is specific," Arion said. "That's what I keep him for." A long silence. The horses shifted. One of the bowmen on the roof adjusted his angle infinitesimally. The cold air between the 2 groups of men had the particular texture of a thing about to become something else. What happens in this moment, in the space between a decision and its execution, is one of the most instructive things a person can observe about human nature. Vareth Thorn had spent 2 years constructing a pathway to power that required, above all things, patience. He had been patient. He had built carefully. He had waited for the exact fracture he needed. And now he was sitting on a gray horse looking at an outcome that had not gone according to the sequence, and the question his nervous system was asking, The question every human being asks in this moment was whether to accept the reality in front of him or continue insisting on the reality he had planned for. Most people, when they have invested enough in a plan, choose the second option. Vareth chose. The queen, he said, is a destabilizing element in the succession. Any advisor of the crown with the empire's interests at heart would recognize that a deposed queen in open territory with the heir creates a vulnerability that, her name, Arion said, is Seris Vale. She is the mother of my son, and she is under imperial protection. The next thing you say to me about her will be in front of the high court. Vareth looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the garrison building, at the window where she stood. She held his gaze. This is the moment she had been moving toward since the barge on the second canal, since the message to Dain, since the high court chamber, and the silence that had flooded it when Arion made his declaration. Not this specific moment. She hadn't known it would take this shape. But this quality of moment, where the thing trying to erase her was forced to look directly at her and encounter the fact of her continued existence. She did not perform composure for him. She simply was composed, which is different, and which he apparently understood was different, because something in his face shifted from calculation to something older. He looked back at Arion. "You'll execute me," he said. Not a question, not a plea, an assessment. Vareth law on treason is specific, Arion said. I don't make exceptions for bloodlines. I spent 20 years serving this empire, Vareth said. I know, Arion said. And there was something in his voice, not forgiveness, not softness, but the genuine weight of a man who is not enjoying this and is doing it anyway because the alternative is worse. I know that. It doesn't change what you did. Vareth looked at his 6 men, then at the 2 bowmen on the roof, then at the 4 riders in the yard. I was doing the math that Seris had done on the road in the dark, the night before, with 4 men and a blade she'd taken by hand. The math that tells you when the arithmetic no longer works in your favor, and the only remaining question is what you do about that. He drew his sword. It was not an attack. He held it level, point down, the gesture of formal surrender in Vareth military tradition. An acknowledgement that the sequence was complete. His 6 men looked at each other. Then, one by one, they dismounted and set their weapons on the ground. Brained soldiers moved in from the garrison's flanks. She had not even seen them deploy, which meant Arion had positioned them before stepping outside, which meant he had accounted for this outcome as carefully as the other ones. She exhaled. The exhale lasted a long time. She let it. The processing of Vareth Thorn and his 6 men took 3 hours, during which Seris sat with Kaelor in the garrison's main room and let him eat everything the kitchen could produce and ask every question he had accumulated over the past several days, which were numerous and mostly practical. Why was the horse brown? Why did garrison soldiers sleep in the same room? Why did the physician carry his instruments in a leather bag instead of a wooden box? Could they get a dog when they got to where they were going? She answered every question. The normalcy of the questions was deliberate medicine that she administered to both of them, because the thing about surviving something extreme is that the survival itself requires a bridge back to ordinary life, and children are extraordinarily good at building that bridge if you let them lead. She let Kaelor lead. By the time Arion came back inside, the room felt like a room again rather than a tactical position. He sat down across the table from her. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of someone who had ridden hard, though he had something deeper. The specific exhaustion of a person who has spent 2 days resolving consequences of their own making and has arrived at the other side of it carrying everything they couldn't put down. Kaelor looked at him with the direct assessment of a 4-year-old who has decided to ask the thing he actually wants to know. Did you win? Kaelor said. Arion looked at his son for a moment. Mostly, he said. Kaelor considered this. My instructor says mostly isn't a real answer. Your instructor, Arion said, is right about most things. That's what Mama says too. Kaelor seemed satisfied by the convergence of adult opinion and returned to his meal. Arion looked at Seris. She looked back. There was nothing left to maneuver around. That was the particular quality of this moment that distinguished it from every conversation they had conducted over the previous 6 years. All the maneuvering had been burned away by the past 4 days, leaving whatever was actually underneath, which was 2 people sitting across from each other in a garrison kitchen in the Keld foothills with their son between them, looking at the wreckage of what they had built and the shape of what remained. Mareth will be transported to the Sunless Palace under guard, Arion said. I'll ride with him. His men are in Brain's custody until I can get the proper administrative transfer arranged. He paused. Kossel has been detained. The secondary channel. Dismantled. He looked at his hands. Vareth will spend the next month going through every authorization that moved through it. We'll find everything. She nodded. Nisara left the palace, he said. She looked at him. 3 days ago. Of her own will. She sent me a letter through Dreveth. He was quiet for a moment. She said she had come back for something that didn't exist the way she remembered it. She said... He stopped. Chose the honest version. She said she had spent years imagining a man who had, in the meantime, built a life that changed him, and that she didn't hold it against him, but she had no interest in being a consolation prize for the life that life had cost him. Seris sat with that. The emotional mathematics of this information was complex, and she did not try to resolve it quickly. Nisara had been her antagonist in the clearest sense, the person whose arrival had catalyzed everything that followed, and she was also, apparently, a woman capable of an honest self-assessment sharp enough to draw blood. Those two things could both be true, and they were, and Seris let them be true simultaneously rather than requiring one to cancel the other. She was right, Seris said finally, about what she said in the letter. I know, he said. You're different than you were when she knew you. Yes. Not better, different. She looked at him steadily. Better implies a direction. You're just changed. The question of whether the change is sufficient is something you're going to have to answer over time, not in one conversation. He absorbed this without defending against it. Fair. And the answer doesn't change what I told you last night, she said. I'm still going to Eldra Reach. That decision isn't contingent on Nisara or Mareth or any of the things that happened this week. It was the decision before any of this, and it remains the decision. I know, he said. You're not going to try to... No, he said. The word was clean and complete. No negotiation beneath it. I'm not going to try to change your mind. I was wrong to think that the weight of what you had here would be more than your dignity. I won't make that mistake twice. She looked at him for a long moment. This is where the easy version of the story would insert a reversal, a softening. The accumulated weight of shared history and the extremity of the past 4 days creating a gravitational pull back toward what was. Stories built on the architecture of reconciliation require it, the return, the restoration, the closing of the circle. But real people do not always return to the circle. Sometimes the most honest ending is a person walking forward rather than back, carrying the knowledge of what the circle cost them, and choosing a different shape for what comes next. Seris had been that person since the corridor outside the High Court chamber. She was still that person. She was just also now something additional. Something she hadn't been before. Not harder. She resisted that word, because hardness was a misunderstanding of what survival produces in people who survive with their humanity intact. What she was now was more specific. She had a clearer outline. The past 6 years and the past 4 days had burned away everything that didn't belong to her essential self, leaving something that was more precisely and deliberately hers than anything she had been at the start. That was worth something. It was worth everything, actually. She turned to Kaelor. Can you find the physician and ask him if there is more of the dried fruit? Very politely. Kaelor slid off his chair with the alacrity of someone who has been given a mission that involves food. He disappeared into the corridor. Seris looked back at Arion. I need to ask you something, she said. And I need the honest answer, not the answer that makes you look better. Ask. When you rode out last night, when you came down that road. She watched his face. Were you riding for Kaelor, or were you riding for me? He held her gaze without looking away. Both, he said. And I knew when I rode out that by the time I got there, both would be the same thing. Because losing you and losing him are not separate losses. I understand that now. I understand it in the exact way you understand something when it's too late for the understanding to do what it should have done earlier. She nodded once. That's the honest answer, she said. It's the only one I have. She stood up from the table. The thing about understanding something too late, she said, is that too late is not the same as too late for everything. It just means certain doors are closed. There are others. He looked up at her. Kaelor will know you, she said. He'll grow up knowing both his parents and understanding that they are separate people with separate lives, and that their separation is not a commentary on his value to either of them. That's not a small thing. That's the thing I am choosing to build, and I'm asking you to build it with me from your end. And if you do that, if you do it consistently and over time, then what we made, even accounting for everything it cost us, will have been worth something." He stood up. They faced each other across the table. He was taller than her and always had been, and the difference had felt in certain years like a metaphor for the imbalance between them. It did not feel like that now. It felt like two people standing at the same elevation despite the difference in height, which is what happens when the social and political infrastructure of inequality is finally, completely removed. "I'll do that," he said. "I'll do it correctly, whatever it takes." She believed him. Not because he deserved uncomplicated belief. He had demonstrated clearly what happened when belief was given without receipts. She believed him because she had just watched him spend 2 days and a cold road earning it, and because belief extended on earned grounds is not naivety. It is the only functional kind. "Then we agree," she said. Taylor returned with the dried fruit and the information that the physician's name was Orvin, and that Orvin also had a dog, which was living in the stable, and that the dog's name was Brick, and that it was unclear why it was named Brick, but Kaylor had his theories. He presented this report to both parents simultaneously with the democratic impartiality of a 4-year-old who sees no reason why information should be delivered to only one person when two are available. Iarion looked at his son. Something moved across his face that was not political and not strategic and not the expression of a king managing a situation. It was the expression of a man encountering something that is more important than everything else, and knowing it, and having no language sufficient for the knowing. "What's your theory?" he said to Kaylor. "About the name." Taylor sat down and began constructing his argument with the architectural seriousness that Seris recognized as one of his defining qualities, and which, she could now see clearly, had come from both of them in equal and different measure. She sat down too. The garrison kitchen was warm and smelled of the morning's cooking and the cold coming under the door, and the clean functional smell of a military building that did its job without decoration. Outside, the Keld foothills were white with frost under a sky that had finally decided to be blue. The road west was empty. The road east was clear. 2 weeks later, on a morning that smelled of pine and turned soil, Seris Vale arrived in Eldra Reach with her son and a horse she had purchased at the Marev crossing. A different horse, this one brown-black with a white marking on its face that Kaylor had immediately named, and which the name had immediately stuck because that was the way of names applied by children to animals. The province was as she remembered it. Open land running up to foothills, northern wind with teeth. People who assessed you based on what you did with your hands rather than who your family was or what title preceded your name. The house she had been directed to through the Eldra Reach administrator, a stone building with a south-facing garden and 3 rooms that needed work but had good bones and better light, stood at the edge of the provincial settlement, with fields on 2 sides and the foothills visible to the north. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. Kaylor ran immediately into the largest room and announced from inside that it echoed, which he was testing repeatedly. She stepped through the doorway. The floor was cold stone and the walls were plain and the windows were small and let in more light than expected given their size. The garden had gone to wild grass through the autumn, but the soil beneath it was dark and deep, the kind of soil that has been resting and will produce well when something is asked of it. She put her bag down on the floor. She sat down on the floor, which was the only surface available. She sat in the empty room of her own house in a province that did not know her history, with her son's voice echoing through the rooms and the northern wind finding the gaps in the window frames. And she let herself feel the full weight of everything she had arrived here through. Not to wallow in it. She was not built for wallowing, but because there is a specific and necessary act of acknowledgement that we owe to the hardest chapters of our lives. To sit inside what they cost and what they produced, and to say, without performance, without the requirement that it immediately resolve into something useful, this was real, this was mine, I carried it the full distance. She had carried it the full distance. She sat on the cold stone floor of her own house, and let that be true. Taylor appeared in the doorway. He looked at her sitting on the floor with the equanimity of a child who has learned in the past 2 weeks that adults sometimes need to sit on floors without a specific reason, and that this is acceptable and does not require commentary. He came and sat beside her. They sat together in the empty room. "Is this ours?" he said. "Yes," she said. "All of it. All of it." He looked around the room with the appraising attention of someone taking ownership of a space. "It needs things," he said. "It does. But it has the good kind of empty, he said, the kind that's waiting. She looked at him, 4 years old, with his father's jaw in her eyes, sitting on a cold stone floor in a house at the edge of Eldra Reach, delivering an assessment of waiting space that most people spend decades trying to articulate. Yes, she said, exactly that kind. She put her arm around him. He leaned into her side. Outside, the northern wind moved through the pine trees and the turned soil and the wild grass of the garden that would become something else in spring. The sky was the particular blue of very cold, clear days in high country. Not the washed blue of warm seasons, but something harder and more absolute. The blue of a sky that has nothing to prove and requires nothing from the people looking at it. This is what the aftermath of great storms produces in people who survive them with their essential selves intact. Not triumph, not the dramatic vindication that stories promise as the reward for suffering. Something quieter and more durable. A clarity about what actually matters and what was always decoration. A sharper, more accurate understanding of the self, unclouded by the performances that social position requires. The knowledge, earned through loss rather than instruction, that a person's worth is not conferred by where they stand, but by who they are when standing becomes impossible, and they find a way to stand anyway. Seris Vale had been a queen. She was something more specific now. A woman who had chosen, under conditions that would have broken most people, to know herself first and build from there. The house was empty and waiting and full of good light, and it was hers entirely, and in the morning she would begin the work of making it into what she intended. She stayed on the floor a little longer. She was not in a hurry. In the Sunless Palace, Arian Thorne sat alone in his private study on a Tuesday evening, with the administrative consequences of Vareth Thorne's treason spread across his desk in the organized documentation of a political catastrophe being systematically resolved. Kossel had given Vareth everything in exchange for a lesser charge. 3 additional advisors had been implicated, removed, and were awaiting trial. The secondary intelligence channel had been not merely dismantled but rebuilt from the ground up, with a structure that Vareth had designed to make Mareth's approach architecturally impossible for the next generation of opportunists. The palace was quieter than it had been. Nisara's absence had a different quality than Seris's absence. Sarah's absence felt like a room that had been briefly occupied and then returned to its original state. Seris's absence felt like a room that had been redefined by what had been built there, and which no subsequent occupant would encounter without encountering the evidence of that building. He did not try to fill it. He worked. He had always worked well. He would continue to work well. The empire did not become less complicated or less demanding because its king had been forced by events to understand things about himself that he had spent years avoiding. If anything, the empire was more demanding now, in the specific way that demanding things become more demanding when you are no longer able to bring comfortable self-deception to them. He had been wrong in the way that men who have too much power for too long are wrong. Not viciously, not from malice, but from the gradual replacement of attention with assumption. He had assumed devotion was structural. He had assumed that what he did not tend would continue to exist unattended. He had assumed that the people who held his world together were holding it together because that was the nature of their position, and not because they had made daily choices to do so, choices that required from him a reciprocity he had not provided. He had paid the price of those assumptions in full. He intended to pay it without resentment, which was the only honest way to pay a price you had earned. On his desk, beside the administrative files, sat a single piece of paper with a child's drawing on it. Kaelor had sent it with the first dispatch rider who traveled north from Vareth toward Eldra Reach, 2 days after Arion returned to the palace. It was a drawing of a horse, identifiable as such by the 4 vertical lines that were legs and the horizontal body, and the upward line that was meant to be a tail. Beside the horse was a stick figure that was clearly Kaelor because it was smaller than everything else. Beside Kaelor was a house. In the sky above the house, Kaelor had drawn several shapes that might have been clouds, or might have been birds, or might have been something entirely his own. Arion had looked at that drawing for a long time the night it arrived. He looked at it again now. Then he picked up his pen and returned to the work of governing an empire he was learning, late and at great cost, to hold with open hands rather than closed ones. The pine trees in Eldra Reach moved in the northern wind. The garden was wild and waiting. The woman once overlooked, who had been a daughter, a political arrangement, a queen consort, a target, a woman on a barge on a dark river, a woman with a blade on a cold road, and many other things she had been required to be by circumstance before she had the ground under her feet to simply be herself, stood in her south-facing garden in the afternoon light, and breathed the clean northern air, and did not perform anything for anyone. She was sovereign here, not of land, not of title, of the one territory that had always been hers to rule, and which she had spent years learning to reclaim from the accumulated weight of other people's definitions. Herself. Simply, completely, and at great cost, herself. Above the garden, the hard northern sky held its blue without apology. Below it, a woman stood in wild grass and began to think about spring.